On the UK response to the human rights and economic situation in Sri Lanka, and I call Elliot Colburn to move.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper that this House is concerned by reports of increased militarisation and human rights violations in Sri Lanka, particularly during the country's current economic crisis. And it calls upon the government, as a key stakeholder of the International Monetary Fund, to propose conditionalities on any IMF financial assistance for Sri Lanka during the current economic crisis, including that Sri Lanka carries out a strategic defence and security review to reduce its military spending and remove the military from engaging in commercial activities, that Sri Lanka meets the criteria required for the Generalised Scheme of Preference Plus, and that Sri Lanka re-engages with the United Nations Human Rights Council process and fully implements Resolution 30.1 and subsequent amendments, and calls upon the government to implement a targeted set of sanctions against individuals who are credibly accused of committing war crimes during the Sri Lankan Civil War. Can I begin by thanking the Backbench Business Committee for making time for this important debate, and can I particularly thank my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, the member for Richmond Park, the member for East Ham, the member for High Wycombe, and indeed the dozens of other colleagues who have sponsored the application for this debate. And I declare an interest as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Tamils and as a Member of Parliament representing thousands of Tamil constituents in Carshalton and Wallington. And it's to those constituents first that I would like to thank for reaching out to me to talk more about the situation in Sri Lanka, as well as the various community groups we have heard as part of the APPG since the Parliament was reformed in 2019. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's been over 13 years since the Civil War came to an end, and the origins of that conflict stretched back several decades and resulted in well over 100,000 deaths from all sides. However, it was during the final months of the conflict in 2009 which saw things take a particularly bloody turn for the worst. During this period, the Sri Lankan military deliberately targeted thousands of civilian lives, committing grotesque genocidal acts, war crimes and crimes against humanity, largely against the Tamil population of the island. The culmination of these atrocities was the Mullawaikau massacre. In 2009, a strip of land in Mullawaikau, Sri Lanka, was designated as a so-called no-fire zone. These were designated areas where civilians were told to gather to avoid being harmed. However, nothing could be further from the truth in Mullawaikau. Sri Lankan government forces entrapped tens of thousands of civilians in the zone and committed heinous war crimes. After providing an initial death toll of 40,000, the United Nations found evidence suggested that as many as 70,000 were killed. Local census records indicate that at least 146,679 people are still unaccounted for and presumed to have been killed. By examining different sources, including the United Nations, census figures and World Bank data, the International Truth and Justice Project has found that the highest estimate of those killed during that final phase could be as large as 169,796. Most of these deaths were as a result of the Sri Lankan government forces shelling civilian buildings, including hospitals. There were also reports of civilian bunkers being targeted with grenades, people being run over by military vehicles, and surrendering civilians being stripped naked and executed. Rape and sexual violence... I will gladly give way.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for giving way and commend him on what is a really brave and accurate speech, in my opinion. Would he agree with me that all the things he's cited about the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of people on the beach, the targeting of Tamils, fits the definition of a genocide?
I'm grateful to my constituency neighbour for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with her. I think one of the shocking things that we have heard, and she will know this as a member of the APPG, is that those credibly accused of committing these war crimes have been or have recently been or still currently are serving at the top level of Sri Lankan society. That is absolutely shocking, but I will come on to some more of that in my speech, and I will gladly give way.
I thank and congratulate the Honourable Member for having secured this very important debate, because many of my Slough constituents are extremely concerned about the safety and well-being of their loved ones, given the reports of increased militarisation and human rights violation, particularly when the country is going through a severe economic crisis. Does the Honourable Member agree with me that as friends of Sri Lanka, we all have a duty to stand by Sri Lanka in its time of need and impress upon the new government there to promote peace, justice and a brighter future for all, regardless of their background or colour or creed?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for that intervention, and I do absolutely agree with him. And I'm very, very glad that the government has decided to support this motion today so that we can get to work on bringing everyone back around the table, because we have seen so little progress on implementing UN resolutions so far, and there is a lot of hopelessness out there, particularly amongst the Tamil community, that any progress is going to be made. So we really do need to get on top of this and use our position as a friend of Sri Lanka to do just that. So I'm grateful to him for his intervention. Now, if I could talk a little bit more, Mr. Deputy Speaker, about some of the violence and atrocities used during the end of the conflict. Rape and sexual violence against Tamil women, and indeed some reports of Tamil men during the final stages of the armed conflict and in its aftermath, are also considered to be greatly underreported, and that's according to an OHCHR investigation on Sri Lanka. Several witnesses have spoken about women being taken away towards the jungle by soldiers allegedly for sexual abuse as they crossed over into government-controlled territory. An investigation by Human Rights Watch reported on one woman's experience, which she explains. The army made us strip completely in front of the children. All the women were made to walk around the soldiers in a circle. The soldiers were laughing at us. All of the women were then raped in front of everyone. My daughter and I were raped in front of her children. I was raped in front of my grandchildren. After about 2 hours, the soldiers asked a naked boy and girl who didn't know each other to hug each other at gunpoint. As they hugged due to fear, they were shot in front of our eyes. Mr. Deputy Speaker, these atrocities didn't take place in a medieval skirmish some hundreds of years ago. They took place in a Commonwealth country in 2009. Many of my constituents and other members of this place have suffered to this day because of the crimes that they saw or were subjected to, and the physical and mental scars are still there. And 13 years later, these families are still waiting for peace, justice, truth, and accountability. Now, I am pleased that last month the UN Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 51/L1 on Sri Lanka, which will extend and reinforce the capacity of the Office of the High Commissioner to collect, consolidate, analyse and preserve evidence that may be used in future war crimes trials. Now, of course, the Sri Lankan government has rejected this resolution, as it has before, instead claiming confidence in their own domestic mechanisms, which, 13 years on since the end of the war, are yet to produce any results for victims of the atrocities. The new resolution certainly is a step in the right direction to achieve justice and accountability, but with respect, we've had resolutions before. International action at the Human Rights Council on its own is not enough, and the resolution falls short of providing a mechanism to truly investigate war crimes and pursue criminal accountability. Specific resources are needed to be raised to build cases against those who are accused of war crimes and be prosecuted. Now, criminal accountability should be pursued by referral to the International Criminal Court. Those who commit war crimes should not enjoy immunity because the state in question is unwilling or unable to prosecute them. Furthermore, the UK should follow other allies from around the world, particularly the United States, and introduce a targeted sanctions regime for those who are credibly accused of committing war crimes and human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. Now, this should include notable Sri Lankan individuals such as Sharendra Silva, the current army commander. General Silva stands credibly accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity during the final phases of the conflict. The accused war criminal was head of the notorious 58 Division during the conflict. Silva's experience as a commander oversaw the unit commit grave violations of international law, and under his command, hospitals were repeatedly bombed and widespread sexual violence, torture and execution of surrendering Tamils occurred. Eyewitnesses also demonstrated that General Silva was present at the Woodavai Bridge, where, according to the available evidence, he oversaw hundreds of surrendering Tamil military and political leaders and their families being subjected to summary execution and arbitrary detention, as well as enforced disappearance. I will gladly give way.
Congratulate the honourable member on securing this important debate today. The implementation of vague laws to facilitate arbitrary arrests and restriction of movement on citizens is something we see in countries with poor human rights records. Laws like this in Sri Lanka make it much harder for those wrongly arrested to challenge detention. So does the honourable member share my concern that access to justice is being actively hindered and leaving activists at too great a risk?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with her. But I would just add an extra layer on this. The difficulty in Sri Lanka is not just the fact that there are those held on false pretences and false charges, but there's also a gravely high number of people who are still missing. We don't know where they are. We don't know where they're being held. So we can't help them. If they're still alive, there is no way of helping those people, and that's the grave situation that islanders are facing at the moment. Now, the UN High Commission on Human Rights has recommended that states, including the UK, should sanction Silva and other alleged perpetrators in Sri Lanka, and the United States did so in 2020. Another individual worth noting is Kamal Goratne, who is the current Defence Secretary in Sri Lanka. In February 2009, he led the final assault from the south of the beaches at Mulavai Cow as the 53rd Division Commander. The assault involved repeated attacks on civilian hospitals, makeshift hospitals and food distribution points, resulting in tens of thousands of civilian casualties. He was also charged of displaced persons whilst hundreds of thousands of civilians... He was also in charge, of displaced persons whilst hundreds of thousands of civilians were held in arbitrary detention after the end of the war, and he was commander of the Joseph Army Camp, which was notorious for torture. By sanctioning these two individuals and many others, the UK government would be supporting both UN and US action in demonstrating that alleged perpetrators of mass atrocities are not welcome in the UK. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, members of the APPG for Tamils have raised this issue multiple times, here in the Chamber, as well as privately and through other channels to the SCDO. So I do hope that the Minister today can provide an encouraging update on the government's position regarding the sanctioning of individuals credibly accused of war crimes. I will gladly give way.
Forward and mind of the fact that the officers may give the commands to do what happens, but the soldiers who do it are also accountable. So when it comes to having their time in court, which we hope they will have, does the honourable gentleman agree that the doing everything to try and catch those soldiers as well is important? The generals can look up because they're big names, but the soldiers need to know they can't get away with it either.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for that intervention, and I do absolutely agree with him, and I do hope that the UK sees that, that new resolution that has been passed at the Human Rights Council in terms of collecting evidence should indeed include those specific soldiers who committed those atrocities as well. Now, of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, the atrocities that occurred in the past in Sri Lanka are only one of the reasons that we're having this debate today. The second part of the motion is about the current economic and political instability in Sri Lanka. Now, the country is suffering its worst economic crisis since gaining independence in 1948. The country defaulted on a $51 billion external debt in mid-April and is in talks with the IMF for a $2.9 billion bailout. Now, due to shortage of hard currency to pay for imports, there have been shortages of basic necessities, including medicines, cooking gas, fuel and food. 3.4 million people are now in need of urgent humanitarian help on the islands. And UN agencies working in Sri Lanka announced just yesterday that they had raised $79 million to feed those in need. But the increasing number of those in need means that another 70 million is estimated to be needed. In July, the new president imposed a state of emergency after his predecessor fled the country and resigned from post following massive anti-government protests about the government's mishandling of the economy, which threw the country into further instability. Now, the SCDO has updated their travel advice over the summer to advise against all but essential travel to the island due to the political and economic instability on the island. Now, the causes of Sri Lanka's financial crisis are multifaceted. Failure to include Tamils, indeed, I will gladly give way.
Does he share my concern that military spending is higher now in Sri Lanka than it was at the height of the civil war? And surely that expenditure is contributing to the debt crisis that the country is facing.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for that intervention. She's been a doughty champion for the Tamil population throughout many, many years in this place, and I'm grateful to her lending her expertise to this debate today. And indeed, one of the points I hope to come on to later is indeed just that. As I was saying, Mr Deputy Speaker, the failure to include Tamils in economic activity, a large defence budget, as my honourable friend has mentioned, to support a disproportionately large military, corruption and, of course, poor fiscal policies have led Sri Lanka's economy to the brink of bankruptcy. And in order for Sri Lanka to be rescued, it needs to reduce its military spending, which stands at $1.86 billion per annum, making it one of the largest militaries in the world, costing more than their health and education budgets combined. The militarisation of the country is also firmly linked to deteriorating human rights concerns on the island. The inaction and the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been used predominantly to target Muslim and Tamil communities, resulting in arbitrary detention, sexual torture and enforced disappearances. In fact, Sri Lanka has the second highest number of UN-registered enforced disappearances in the world, and most of them are Tamils. Furthermore, the Sri Lankan military is engaged in commercial activities in the northeast, including tourism, farming and fishing, stifling the local economy and preventing Tamils from contributing in any meaningful way to economic activity. Now, this needs to be stopped in order to allow for regional economic regeneration. Furthermore, Sri Lanka needs to conduct a strategic and defence and security review, like the one the UK completed in 2021, to ensure its military size reflects its security requirements. Mr Deputy Speaker, all of Sri Lanka's projections to emerge out of the economic crisis are predicated on the country retaining its generalised scheme of Preference Plus trade concessions. The annual trade concession is worth over $500 million and has boosted Sri Lanka's exports to EU member states over the years. However, Sri Lanka has failed to meet key human rights and labour requirements for receiving this preferential treatment. The EU recently issued a warning to Sri Lanka that it was set to lose its concession if it continues to ignore its obligations. I will gladly give way.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for securing this debate and raising these very important matters. Does he agree with me that it's also vital that the UK government demonstrates its support for fair and just development of Sri Lanka through its own trade policy with Sri Lanka? Now we secure our own trade agreements.
For that intervention, and he took the following words that I was about to read just out of my mouth, so I'm very grateful to him for that. In order for Sri Lanka to meet these requirements, it needs to re-engage with the UNHRC and address the human rights abuses, both past and present. Sri Lanka is now seeking its third IMF bailout since the end of the war in 2009, and bailout conditions set by the IMF in the past have focused on economic reform alone and has not prevented Sri Lanka from sliding back to yet another balance of payment crisis. It is vital that the measurements taken this time around are comprehensive and address some of the root causes that the country is facing to elevate Sri Lanka out of the cyclical crisis that it finds itself in. And as a key stakeholder at the IMF, the UK government should propose conditionalities on any IMF financial assistance for Sri Lanka during the current economic crisis, including that Sri Lanka carries out a strategic defence and security review to reduce its military spending, remove the military from engaging in commercial activities, and that Sri Lanka should meet the requirements required for the GSP Plus scheme, and that Sri Lanka re-engages with the UNHRC process. I appreciate that the IMF does not have powers to impose such conditionalities on its own, but the UK, as a key penholder here, can add that significant influence whilst those discussions are taking place before any bailout is agreed. I will gladly give way.
One of the issues that we've consistently raised, in addition to the human rights abuses, is the levels of corruption within Sri Lanka itself. One of the ways in which we've been able to at least expose and tackle that corruption has been through the media, some elements of the excellent media that there is in Sri Lanka, but where there has been, certainly over the last 12 months, but over a longer period as well, but intensively over the last 12 months, the harassment of journalists and the closure down of the free press that there is and the free media that there is there. One of the conditions that should be attached to any form of aid that goes into Sri Lanka now, or any relationship that we have in the future, is one in which they tackle corruption, but they do that as a result of the free media, unharassed by government.
Honourable Member for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with his point about the importance of a free press. And that indeed is having effects beyond the borders of the island. Indeed, a prominent Tamil news outlet, the Tamil Guardian, has been repeatedly engaged in battles with social media companies about their content. The investigations that have been taking place is that Sri Lankan government is actively trying to force social media companies worldwide, not just within the borders of the island, but here in the UK, the Tamil Guardian has had its content taken offline because of complaints from the Sri Lankan state. That cannot be right. I'm conscious that I've been speaking for quite a while, Mr Deputy Speaker, so I want to bring my remarks to a close so we can hear from other backbenchers. I will gladly give way first, though.
Giving way to making a speech in which I would totally agree with. I just want to check, because it's really helpful when we have all-party agreement on this. For all the reasons he set out, does he not agree that we need to review the generalised system of preferences that is given to Sri Lanka? They are not meeting the conditions that they're supposed to. It's time, I think, to withdraw those.
I do totally agree with the right honourable gentleman. Indeed, that's as we've set out in our motion today, which I'm glad is going through unopposed. That is indeed what I think the UK government should be doing. To conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do look forward to hearing from the Minister about what engagement the FCDO has had with the IMF and the UNHRC on this matter. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the human rights and economic situation in Sri Lanka is increasingly deteriorating. In this brief time that I've had, I hope that I've demonstrated succinctly why the UK does need to show international leadership on these issues, not just for our constituents who are still affected by the events that have taken place, but continue to take place on the island, but also to fulfil our international responsibility to a Commonwealth partner in dire need. And I look forward to hearing contributions from other members throughout the course of this debate.